Namaste and welcome to Pods by PEI, a policy discussion series brought to you by Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. My name is Tedon Khondaker. In this very special episode brought to you all the way from Bangladesh, we have the conversation between Saurabh Lama, Senior Programs Officer at Policy Entrepreneurs Inc., and Dr. Khondaker Ghulam Moazzem. Moazzem is the Research Director at the Center for Policy Dialogue, CPD, Bangladesh, with interests including development of industrial enterprises, entrepreneurship development, private investment including FDI, competition policy and trade at the bilateral, regional, and multilateral levels. Moazzem holds a PhD from the Kyoto University, Japan, and was a visiting fellow at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Kyoto University. In this episode, Saurabh and Moazzem discuss the overall landscape of the Bangladeshi electricity sector, the various factors that have shaped the electricity market in the nation, and how Bangladesh was able to overcome its significant load shedding. They also discuss the scope of renewables in the LNG-dominated system, and finally, the scope for Nepal as the future exporter of electricity to Bangladesh. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Welcome to this very special episode of Pause by PEI, all the way from Bangladesh. Moazzem, I've been really looking forward to hosting this conversation with you.
It's also a great pleasure for me to participate in this discussion while you come from Nepal and we have a common understanding and issues with the power and energy sector. So I'm also feeling really encouraging to participate in this discussion.
It is indeed a pleasure to have you on the show. Shall we get started?
Please go ahead.
Let's begin by setting the context within which today's conversation is taking place. This will help our listeners who are perhaps more familiar with the issues of Nepal to better understand why you and I are talking about the Bangladeshi electricity sector. By the end of our conversation today, I hope that we are able to provide a better overview of what the Bangladeshi electricity sector looks like and what sort of possibilities lie ahead for Nepal and Bangladesh to collaborate within the sector. So, how would you describe to someone who is not familiar with Bangladesh the performance of the country's power sector? We will get into some of the details later, but let's begin with an overarching view.
Let's actually target to the Nepali audience. I think since Bangladesh and Nepal, both the country has a tremendous demands for power and energy for its growing economy. And both the countries are actually looking for more power generation, more power supply to its economic activities. While Nepal is depending on its hydropower, on the other hand, in case of Bangladesh, we are actually depending on multiple sources of energy, whether it is natural gas, petroleum, liquefied natural gas, coal, and as well as renewable energy. You can easily understand that in Bangladesh, every year, around 10% growth in the electricity demand is taking place. Because of a rising demand of electricity for various kinds of economic activities and government's more focus on infrastructure development as well as to support to the industries, commerce and other related businesses, even in the agriculture, we need much more electricity here. And that's why the government since 2009 has provided much more importance on electricity generation in the country.
So what do you think about the overall performance of the sector? Is it up to what the Bangladeshi people have come to expect?
You may see the things in two ways. One is that the electricity availability, in terms of the electricity availability, it has reached at a very good level. At this moment, we have an excess generation capacity. So it indicates that we have a good electricity available to supply. On the other hand, there are other aspects of it is that quality of the electricity and the power which the industry usually demands. There we need to improve it a lot. I think one of the important aspect of it is that in terms of the per capita electricity demands, it has reached to around 500 kilowatt hour, which was even in 10 years back less than half. So over time, the electricity demands and electricity availability has been significantly improved in the country. But what happened here is that over time, government has put more focus on generation and relatively less on transmission and the distribution. That's why while we have an excess electricity capacity, on the other hand, you may often heard about load shedding. This is because of lack of transmission and distribution capacity, which has yet to develop as per a requirement of the power sector.
I like how you touched on the demand side of things. So now, getting more into the details of things, can you please expand on the demand scenario of the Bangladeshi electricity sector? Could you give us insights into the recent trends, including what the current demand for electricity is?
In case of the electricity demand, it is basically a household demand, which is around 35%, and as well as the industry demands, which is around 30%. And the commerce and businesses has other 15 to 10%. So overall, a good demand of the electricity is for the household level. But with the growing demand of the industries, we need to have that kinds of transmission and the distribution system to supply this excess electricity to different kinds of activities. You will be very happy to know that government is actually putting more emphasis on the infrastructure and where this electricity will be demand. For example, the metro rail, which will be inaugurated soon. This will be a good important requirement for the electricity in the service sector. Government is planning to build 100 special economic zones all over the country, and that will also require a huge electricity. And at this moment, 12 of the special economic zone are already at a stage of operation. So electricity demand is actually rising there. And apart from that, the electricity demand at the household level, as well as the business and the commerce in the rural areas, those are increasingly getting diversified. Even in the agriculture, agro-processing, electricity demand is actually rising.
I like something that you noted in your 2018 paper, the link to which we will provide in our show notes. How is Bangladesh on its way to achieving its national demand goals? I do realize that in your paper, you mentioned, as per the power sector master plan, the total demand projected is 27,400 megawatts by 2030 and 51,000 megawatts by 2041. How realistic do you think these estimates are?
I think you are right. This is one of the issue which we often actually discussed. Demand projection has been done very simplistically. In the power sector master plan, it has basically considered the gross domestic product, meaning the total national economy and the size of the economy. But it doesn't actually take into consideration of the individual sectoral demands and the individual sectoral changes over time. For example, in case of the Bangladesh's overall economy, 56% of the total GDP comes from the service sector. But service sector doesn't actually not so much of energy intensive or the electricity intensive. Rather, the electricity demand is much higher in the industry sector, manufacturing sector, which is contributed around 27%. And the rest of the other things are related to the domestic part, where it is also the electricity demand is relatively at a limited level, and the agriculture sector electricity demand is relatively less. So what we are proposing to the government is to do this estimate based on a bottom-up approach, considering the sectoral requirements, considering the individual subsectoral demands and requirements, and thereby calculate it. If we do not do that, it will rather project a very huge demand, and that has created a inflationary investment demands among the investors. Taking that target of 27,000 and 50,000 of the power sector master plan, huge investments have been taken place for power generation over the last decade, and now we have around 42% of the excess generation capacity, which is also a burden for the country now.
So now that you've given us a picture of what the supply scenario looks like in Bangladesh, you also touched on this a little bit earlier. The Nepali and the Bangladeshi electricity sectors have gone through some very interesting and very similar historical upheavals and tribulations, where both countries had to go through significant load shedding phases. For Nepal, it was primarily the completion of the cross-border transmission line that allowed for the import of electricity from India to meet its deficit. So what was the case for Bangladesh?
Overall, Bangladesh's case nowadays a little bit different from what we have in a historical similarity with Nepal. While we have a huge deficit of electricity at some point, and you are basically largely dependent on your hydropower and importing electricity from India, in case of Bangladesh, that deficit actually took place because of the poor and lack of governance here. Now, a significant investment has taken place over the last decade in the power sector, particularly by the public sector as well as the private sector, in generation and partly in the transmission and distribution. And this have been happened through independent power producers as well as investment in gas sector development, import of LNG. Thereby, energy has been ensured for supplying electricity. And over time, the private sector has made a significant contribution. Now, at this moment, I think private sector share in total electricity generation is over 51%. It is mostly domestically driven, and partly we are importing electricity from India. I think at this moment we are importing 1,600 megawatt of electricity from 2 channels from India. But we are very happy to import more from alternate sources like Nepal and like to diversify our electricity base. In a sense, we like to diversify our electricity energy mix more of on a renewable and the clean energy point of view.
Yeah, that is something that I will bring up on the later sections. But for now, I quickly wanted to bring back the source that is liquefied natural gas, LNG. So, Bangladeshi electricity sector is dominated by LNG. Could you give us an overview of the supply mix and also perhaps shed some light on what propelled this rapid development of the LNG movement in Bangladesh?
Historically, Bangladesh's energy sector is driven by its domestic natural gas. And we have over time very adequately used our domestic natural gas for electricity generation and for other purposes. But recent time, what we have realized that the domestic proven reserves are gradually depleting. And in one source, it is said that within next 8 years, this proven reserve will be depleted almost nil. So it created demands for alternate sources of gas, and that's why government went for imported LNG sector. But what is quite unfortunate for us is that this decision has been taken at a time when government didn't actually took enough focus on exploring the other gas blocks, particularly the offshore gas blocks. There are more than 15 offshore gas blocks in the Bay of Bengal. And we didn't actually take the opportunity for extracting gas from those gas blocks, while India and Myanmar already got reserves there, but we didn't actually explore that. While we actually kept that option there, we jumped into the LNG, which I think is not a very wise decision for going for an LNG mix in the power sector. And it has created a high cost of energy mix nowadays in Bangladesh.
So where do you think this supply mix is headed to? How do you see this evolving in the next 5 or 15 or 30 years from now?
I think because of the Ukraine-Russia war, government has started to realize that it should not actually dependent on the imported energy mix a lot. It should actually focus on other domestic sources, and that's why they have started to explore the old gas wells to generate gas. But at the same time, it is also true that the way the domestic gas is actually depleting, it needs to actually finding out alternate sources. And it has a tendency to actually move towards LNG-based power generation by importing LNG from different countries. But what is our suggestion is that government should equally put emphasis on the domestic gas blocks for exploring it, as well as the old gas blocks to get more gases there, which is available, and as well as to focus more on the renewable energy, and also from the imported hydropower-based electricity from Nepal. So what we are expecting is that those imported electricity would be cheaper vis-a-vis those of the imported LNG-based power generation that could take place in Bangladesh. Our thinking are in two ways. One is that access and availability of the cheap sources, and another is that more greener and the cleaner sources of energy.
I think this is very important because of all the conversation that is happening around climate change and the reliance of nations on carbon-intensive fuels. So I'll touch on this topic again, but I just wanted to follow up on the LNG and the carbon-intensive fuel that is dominating the Bangladesh grid. Is there purely a commercial reason as to why Bangladesh still relies heavily on LNG or coal?
Yeah, I think it is a commercial reason and to some extent a little bit natural reason, because it has its domestic gas, it has its domestic coal, and that's why there was a natural choice for any developing country to extract its own minerals at first. But Bangladesh started to realize that that kinds of natural advantage is not the single determining factor, because Bangladesh is one of the major climate vulnerable country, and Bangladesh is also committed to go for much more carbon neutral economy by 2050. And it has also committed in the global platform to increase the renewable energy share to 40% by 2041. So if I actually like to consider those kinds of targets, the way it is currently being actually driven is not up to the mark. It is still being pressured by different lobbies nowadays, which are basically LNG lobby is there, the IPP lobbies are there. who are like to retain on this hydrocarbon-based electricity generation there. But I think there are scopes and opportunities there to move towards renewables there. Before 5 years, I think there are some sorts of a belief that Bangladesh is not suitable for renewable energy because it's a very small economy. Land is very scarce, while the renewable energy requires a huge amount of land. But now it has been increasingly realized that we have a huge amount of land available. For example, the river shores, which are not being used for alternate agriculture purposes, can be easily used for generating renewable energies. Now government has announced that all primary schools will actually go for rooftop-based, solar-based power generation for their own use. So I think government and the policymakers as well as the other stakeholders started to realize that yes, the renewable energy has good potential in Bangladesh and it could be a good source given the current economic turmoil and the high debt burden that caused for the hydrocarbon-based electricity.
So obviously there you touched on the growing risk of climate change, a fact that you also mentioned, and Bangladesh is also quite cognizant of this risk. You also mentioned that Bangladesh does have potential for renewables. So how do renewables factor into the mix?
Even a few years back, if you talk to the policymakers, they said that Bangladesh didn't actually contribute much to the global climate change and the global carbon emission. It has global contribution is less than 0.4%. So Bangladesh need not require to actually invest a lot to the renewable energy. And because of that negative perception, till now, we have only 700 megawatt of renewable energy available, where the hydropower is half of it and the rest of it is actually solar and other sources. But it is also already coming into being, realized by the stakeholders. And a recent study conducted by the Sustainable and Renewable Energy Development Authority, which showed that the renewable energy has a huge potential in the country. And in a baseline scenario, it has a potential of 6,000 megawatt of electricity it could generate. And in a high case scenario, it could generate as high as 22,000 megawatt of electricity.
You have been listening to Pods by PEI. I am Tedon Khondaker, and this is a quick reminder to all of you to do us a favor by sharing us on social media and leaving a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to the show. Now let's get back to the conversation between Saurabh and Moazzem.
So obviously the renewable potential in Bangladesh is huge. But given that there's this amount of potential in Bangladesh, are there any policy level barriers or barriers in general for the mainstreaming of renewable energy in Bangladesh?
Of course, there are lots of barriers to get this potential to be realized. Of course, one is the mindset. A major mindset is that whether renewable can be a good source for base load, which is required all over the year. But that is also found to be much more possible in case of the renewables if it is linked properly with the grid-connected renewable energy sources. Another important point here is that the whole power and energy sector is hydrocarbon-based. All the people working there, their life and livelihood, even in the post-retirement, they are also exploring their jobs in this sector also. So there is a good resistance even within the ministries and within the departments not to go adequately from the hydrocarbon towards the renewable one. And that's why there is a huge pressure even within the machinery not to go extensively to the renewables. And if you go to the policy side, there is a very discriminatory policies. In case of the policies, while the hydrocarbon-based policies are getting the subsidy at a huge amount, they are getting capacity payment at a huge amount. On the other hand, these kinds of subsidy and other supports are not equally applicable for the renewable one. What is our suggestion here is that, at least from the government's political side, this discrimination between the hydrocarbon and the renewable in terms of the fiscal benefits to be abolished. And more importantly, all kinds of subsidies and others provided to the hydrocarbon-based power generation should be gradually reduced and gradually to be stopped. Rather, more positively, discriminatory support is required for the renewable-based power generation. Particularly, what we think is necessary in case of the renewable case is that government should take the responsibility of the transmission, setting up the transmission line and the distribution line, which is at this moment is the responsibility of the renewable energy investors to invest in that part. And that also create a much more discouraging factor for the investors to go for the renewable one. Another one is that the banks, multinational banks and the local banks also take a proactive move towards green growth and clean energy based initiatives. And these banks are also not yet fully ready to fully support to the clean energy, because they still consider a little bit risky and not yet fully come forward to support adequately. And the cost of fund is also quite high. While they are much more interested to support coal-based power generation as well as the hydrocarbon-based power generation, I think banks also take a much more bolder step that they should also gradually stop lending this hydrocarbon-based power generation and gradually move towards more cleaner and energy-based power generation.
Are there any policies that have already come into effect that mandate the country to start producing renewable energies? Are there any renewable hydro power obligations, anything of that nature?
Yes, a number of policies are there. We have a renewable energy policy 2008, which is a little bit older and need to be revised and updated. We have the 8th five-year plan, which is now being implemented from 2021 to 2025. We have a perspective plan from 2021 to 2041. And all these policies are actually partly and fully supporting for gradually move towards renewable energy. Even the Prime Minister herself, before the COP26, announced that Bangladesh will gradually move towards renewable energy, and overall energy mix from the renewable will be reached to 40% by 2041. So we are actually looking into that. The most important document at this moment government is preparing is that Integrated Energy and Power System Master Plan. And we are actually looking into it because this document may guide in the future decade at what sorts of energy mix country will go. But at this moment, the draft as it is available, we are not very enthusiastic about it. Though it is mentioned that it is targeting net zero carbon emission, it is targeting to the climate related vulnerabilities. Unfortunately, the way the policy has been formulated in terms of the energy mix point of view, it is not so encouraging. And that's why we think that much more effort is needed from the government side to align this government. And another thing is that there is a problem of lack of alignment of different policies. While this Integrated Power and Energy System Master Plan is produced by the Ministry of Power and Energy, on the other hand, there are other two very good important policy documents, Moazzem Prosperity Plan. And this is one of the addressing the climate related vulnerabilities what the country will do. And this document is prepared by Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But there is a lack of acknowledgement of the targets mentioned in the Moazzem Prosperity Plan in this Integrated Power and Energy System Master Plan. So there is a lack of alignment, lack of harmonization of the policies that also affect a lot in case of the improvement of the energy and the power development. Even the government nationally determined contribution, NDC, which it targets in 2021 for the net zero emission, is not fully aligned with what government is doing in the power and energy sector, which is largely on hydrocarbon based. And our center did a research and it found that even if this current mode of energy generation, transmission, distribution going on, it will not adequate enough to reach to the NDC targets in terms of reducing the carbon emission.
So now let's take a step back and examine the institutional arrangements of the electricity sector here. What is your overall evaluation of how Bangladeshi power sector is governed?
I think the power sector has two wings in the Ministry of Power and Energy and Mineral Resources. This is the main body, and it has two big departments. One is the Division of Power and another is Division of Energy and Mineral Resources. And under that, there are lots of various kinds of subsidiaries, companies and others there. But the major political decisions comes from the Prime Minister's office, which has given the other decision. A good number of private sector entities are also there, like Independent Power Producers Association, as well as public-private joint venture initiatives are there, which is called Infrastructure Development Company Limited, ITCOL, which is supporting for green energy-based initiatives. Also, there is another authority, Sustainable and Renewable Energy Development Authority, SREDA, which is also promoting the renewable energy one. However, despite having lots of different kinds of institutions and others, largely these institutions are driven by the philosophy of promoting the hydrocarbon-based energy and the power generation. That is a major challenge here. I think historically there is an acceptability and requirement of depending on the hydrocarbon because we have an adequate supply of natural gas, we have our coal available there. But as the current reality, and Bangladesh is going to be facing the trouble of the sea level rise, Bangladesh need to realize its current context. So it needs to shift from this hydrocarbon-based institutional structure to move towards more of cleaner energy and the renewable energy-based infrastructure. Unfortunately, that balance is still missing.
So I think I'd also like to touch on the performance of the utility and the distribution companies here in Bangladesh. What has their performance been like?
Overall, Bangladesh's distribution and the transmission system is a public sector base. It is not under the private sector. And because of the huge investment required for the distribution channel and the transmission channel, not so much interest we found by the private sector to invest in those lines. But the one thing happened here is that the transmission system need to be upgraded. One important part is that it need to be smart enough to ensure a smart grid system across the country. Otherwise, it couldn't actually ensure a low-cost energy supply and could attract much more investment in the renewable energy sector as well as in other energies. So we need to have an integrated energy transmission and distribution system, and that need much more investments, which is now divided into two. One is in the eastern part, another is the western part, and that kinds of bifurcation need to be reduced. And also we need a smart grid system, which is very important to attract private investment in the renewable energy, where huge investments is required. Unfortunately, that investment is not yet been actually started, but we are actually expecting that. And we also need a national automated dispatch system, which could ensure a very competitive rates and competitive prices for the consumers. And because of not having it, I think this is very partially used and biasedly used for several private companies who are actually supplying and generating electricity, and they are getting the favor of it. And we think that a smart grid, automated grid, and automated dispatch system could reduce those kinds of inefficiencies and biasness in the system.
So something more to talk about is investments. So as I flew into Dhaka and I was checking into my hotel, I saw the flyover bridge, flyover roads that's being constructed around Dhaka. So clearly foreign aid is also a big part in a lot of the infrastructural development within the country. How big is the foreign aid in terms of the energy sector in Bangladesh?
I think foreign aid is really very important in case of Bangladesh. As I said to you, is that other than the private sector, which is contributed 51% of the total energy supply, energy generation, the rest is under the public sector. And the foreign aid-based investments are happening a lot. All the mega projects in the power sector are jointly or credit support based generation that is actually taking place in Bangladesh. For example, in case of the Matarbari, Bangladesh is going for coal-based power generation there with the support from the Japanese government. Bangladesh is going for the nuclear-based power generation in Shirazganj, Rupur power plant, and that is the credit from the Russian government. Bangladesh is at this moment going for another 2 or 3 coal-based power generation in the southern part, in Patuakhali and in Rampal. And in Rampal, it is supported by Indian line of credit. And in case of China, it is supported in Patuakhali region. So these kinds of credit are increasingly used by Bangladesh for power generation related purposes. As well as the World Bank support is there for energy efficiency related projects. USAID is also supporting an energy efficiency and conservation projects. And Japan is also interested to invest in the renewable energy. Even I think South Korea is also interested to invest in the renewable energy. One of our urge nowadays from the civil society point of view is that those who are now committed to support Bangladesh in terms of the power generation, the power sector development should gradually move from hydrocarbon-based power generation to more towards renewable-based power generation. For example, Bangladesh already dismantled 10 coal-based power plants and those lands are now available. What we are actually like to encourage to the foreign investors, even the local private sector investors to invest renewable energy-based power generation using those lands. So these kinds of promotional initiatives will be needed. And for the COP point of view, since the global development, the developing countries committed there not to invest outside their country on the new investment outside the country on the fossil fuel, that also helping Bangladesh to move from coal-based or the hydrocarbon-based towards more renewable one. For example, recently Japan gave a commitment not to go for the coal-based Matarbari phase 2. The same we are expecting from India, from China, who are major investors of coal-based power generation in country.
So, you've painted a wonderful picture for our listeners about how the Bangladeshi electricity sector looks like. But in all of these initiatives, does electricity trade factor in?
You see, Bangladesh is an emerging developing country, and its energy security was a major constraint even 10 years back. So just within 10 years, Bangladesh's major drive was to ensure access to electricity of its people. Now Bangladesh has started to thinking of using the energy trade at a larger scale, not to use importing energy, but also the exporting energy. And Bangladesh has the capacity now, and this capacity will grow further. And now we are actually moving from pushing the government to access to electricity more or towards more efficient use of resources and efficiency of the electricity sector. And we are also now moving towards more on energy trade. So these kinds of issues are now being discussed and widely debated here in the country. So in the future, I am sure the energy trade will be much more visible within the region. Even the power grid that is developed by Bangladesh and India, there's a dual mechanism available. It is not only for the import of electricity from India, but also for the export of electricity. So we could use even the existing grid to go for exporting electricity even to Nepal as well.
So the reason why I asked that question was because we have now reached a topic that many of our listeners will definitely have in their mind. Is Bangladesh a possible market for Nepali electricity? This curiosity has been brought on by several factors. First and foremost, Nepal now has some surplus electricity during the wet season, which it has started to sell to the Indian market. This surplus is projected to be year-round, and there is excitement about the possibility of tapping into Bangladesh as its next frontier. Beyond this, there seems to have been diplomatic efforts from both the Nepal and Bangladesh sides to make this happen, along with India now finally allowing the use of its transmission infrastructure for trade between third parties. Recently, there was also news that Nepal and Bangladesh have agreed to begin trade of 50 megawatts off of the Upper Karnali hydropower project being built by the Indian company GMR. So from where you stand, how do you see the discussion around Nepal's possibility of selling hydropower to the Bangladeshi electricity market? Is there a possibility of market access for Nepal? Are there any factors, say the prospect of a green new source of electricity that could drive Bangladesh's interest in Nepali hydropower?
I think there are a number of ways these potentialities are there. And of course, that Nepal's hydroelectricity has a good potential in Bangladesh market, provided that Indian transmission system allows, and as you said, that has now allowed the third party to export electricity from Nepal to other country. I think in two ways we may consider. One is that existing excess capacity that you have available, a part of it could come during the summer season when we have a shortage of electricity, particularly during the peak period from evening from 5 to 11 at night. So that's a good time. We need huge amount of electricity. And also in some of the regions where the national grid is not well developed, particularly in the northern part, where Nepal is very close and nearby, and huge amount of new potentials are happening because industries are looking into setting up factories in the northern part as well. And that kinds of factories could be easily supported by the Nepali electricity if those are available. And another opportunity here for Bangladesh is that Bangladeshi investors are also interested to invest in Nepal's hydropower projects. And there are some discussions also going on, and you also mentioned of some of it. I think that potential is also there. Bangladesh can also invest in Nepal's government. How can that be possible? That is an issue. Because maybe your Nepali audience may think that while Bangladesh already has an excess electricity, then how come it go for additional electricity from Nepal? One thing is that a good part of this electricity is not efficient. A good part of this electricity is actually produced at a very high cost. A good part of this electricity are produced in Bangladesh, are produced at a very old power plants, which need huge amount of energy. And Bangladesh need to come out of those expensive power plants. And government has decided to gradually dismantle those old, dated, inefficient and high-cost power plants. Just 2 days back, State Minister for Energy has announced that by June 2023, all diesel-based power plants will be dismantled, which means that that will have a capacity of 1,600 megawatt. So if that is really dismantled, that will create a much more space for additional cleaner energy to come in the Bangladesh. And the same we are actually looking for old public sector power plants, which has a efficiency level less than 15%, 1.5. So those power plants has a very costly and the burdensome for Bangladesh. So those power plants should be dismantled. Same is true for some of the very highly expensive peaking power plants, quick rental power plants, which we think is also need not necessary to operate given the alternate available. And if the Nepali electricity is available during the summer season and during evening hour from 6 to 11, so those kinds of times we could easily use this additional electricity very well. But one thing will be always be necessary, the price should be competitive. I gone through some of the literatures and I wrote an article in the Daily Star a few months back, and I analyzed the price offered by Nepal. And I found that, Nepali price, I think 6 rupees, something like that. If it is converted to Bangladesh, is near the current level, what is available in Bangladesh, average price. It is a very competitive price.
So obviously, if the Nepali electricity is very tempting in terms of the price, what do you reckon should be the delivery arrangements for electricity to come into Bangladesh from Nepal?
I think this kinds of discussion may happen at a technical level. How much potential is there? How much electricity Nepal could supply? And whether they have any seasonality in case of their supply. Because while Nepal in the dry season, they may have a deficit, while in the other season, they may have a huge surplus. So these kinds of things also need to be discussed. But as I say to you, Bangladesh need the electricity during the summer season. And that usually starts from April to September, and mostly during the peak hour in the evening. So that could be one arrangement that we could think of. Another thing is that if we could consider some regional grid and could link the Bangladesh's northern part, which is relatively energy scarce, those areas could be potentially used by Nepali Indian grid lines and to supply electricity those parts. And another interesting and important development happening here is that India itself is also going to invest in Bangladesh's economic zones, and it is going to set up 2 economic zones. I think that could also be used for electricity supply here. And if Bangladesh investors go for investments in Nepal, they could also get this opportunity to how they would actually supply their electricity from those alternate sources.
I like how you brought up on the topic of Bangladeshi investment in Nepal, because it is true that there have been some dialogue surrounding Bangladeshi investment in Nepal, particularly the 383 megawatt Sunkoshi 3. So do you think there is a possibility of investment coming in from Bangladesh to Nepal to develop hydropower projects in Nepal? Are you aware of any discussions around water and energy policy circles of this ever coming to fruition?
In fact, Bangladesh and Nepal bilaterally have been discussing and already have signed an MOU to make investments in Nepalese hydropower sector. And this is basically driven by Bangladesh's big conglomerates who have a huge investment in the power sector. And they like to invest in Nepal as well. And this could be one of our Prime Minister's commitment to go for renewables. And if we go for hydrocarbon, even for the regional market, particularly sourcing from Nepal, that could be also a good opportunity for Bangladesh to move towards that direction. So not only depending on the domestic sources, but also on the regional sources. And Nepal could be a good source there. And Bangladeshi investors could definitely interested to invest in that market as well.
And with that, we come to the end of today's episode. Thank you so much, Moazzem, for your time with us today. This has been a very insightful conversation where I got to learn so much about the Bangladeshi electricity sector. I wish you all the very best for your future endeavors. And thank you once again for coming on to Pods by PEI.
And thanks to you as well. And I hope that through this discussion, Nepali audience could get a better understanding about Bangladesh's power sector and how our regional cooperation and collaboration in the power sector could fruit in the future.
And finally, thank you to all our listeners for tuning in. I wish you all a very good week ahead. Also, I'd like to wish you all a happy new year 2023. We will see you in the new year with another brand new episode. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to Pods by PEI. I hope you enjoyed the conversation between Saurabh and Moazzem, where they discussed the overall landscape of the Bangladeshi electricity sector, the various factors that have shaped the electricity market in the nation, and how Bangladesh was able to overcome its significant load shedding. They also discussed the scope of renewables in the LNG-dominated system, and finally the scope for Nepal as a future exporter of electricity to Bangladesh. Today's episode is part of the Conversations. It was produced by Nirjan Rai with support from Saurabh Lama and Khushi Hang. The episode was recorded at Aring Trade Link Studios in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and edited by Saurabh Lama. Our theme music is courtesy of Rohit Shakya from Jindabad. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe to our podcast. And also, please do us a favor by sharing us on social media and leaving a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to the show. For PEI's video-related content, please search for Policy Entrepreneurs on YouTube. And to catch the latest from us on Nepal's policy and politics, please follow us on Twitter at tweet2PEI. That's tweet followed by the number 2 and PEI. And on Facebook at Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. You can also visit pei.center to learn more about us. Thank you and a Happy New Year from me, Tedon. We'll see you soon in 2023 with our next episode.